Here's the view of the completed system. You can see that it's sitting on the 6 by 8 inch concrete blocks just fine. Each one of these containers weighs about 200 pounds filled up, so these are carrying the load pretty well. As we go up, we see how the frame is fit together. The green shade cloth is there because last summer I noticed that on the old system, on some of the hotter days, everything got really hot because of the sun shining on it. This is the first layer kind of for the spring season, but I expect that I'll probably add another layer on top of this as the summer comes in. As you will see in the construction part of the video, you will see that I did test the strength of these totes by filling them with water, and when I went to install them, I did decide to include 7 zip ties on each side to hold the bottom and the top together. Here you can see that I had cut holes in this about every other one. There's about 17 holes and 16 of them used or can be used for plants. What you do see is that when the plants start to mature, particularly some of the plants like the kales and so on, they get much too big for this kind of spacing. But for lettuces and things, it's just fine. And for larger plants, if you keep them trimmed back, they will not crowd as much. And down here you can see the area where I have the pump, and it's covered with this 2-gallon bucket. There is some noise from the pump here, but not as much as some of the other kinds of pumps that are out in the market. And this is doing a good job with keeping off the rain. So these XL totes are reputed to be very strong, capable of holding 500 pounds. So the question is, when you fill them full of water, what happens? Do they bulge out to the point that the lid's going to be under stress or something? So I filled this one up pretty much the way it's going to be, and the answer is yes. It did bulge out some, and you can see that I have to push this in here. It's holding on pretty steady. It does not seem to be a lot of stress, but I am planning to drill a number of holes here to put zip ties to hold this together, and also make a use of this hole. This one I'll probably just drill straight through to the side there, but I think that's a good idea. Other than that, this is still pretty sturdy, quick, and cheap. This is the support that I'm going to be using for this new system. It's made out of two 2x4s that are about 66 inches long. I used a 2x2 for the cross beam because I had something else in mind when I designed this, but I changed my mind, and if I had used the 2x4 instead of the 2x2, I could have put in 2 screws each and saved having to put in the diagonal beam. When I'm making these things, I'm using 3-inch wood screws, and I'm starting by making a 1/8 inch hole all the way through both of the boards using a long bit, and then on the top board, or where the head of the screw will be, I will use a 3/16 inch drill bit to open up the top board so that the screw doesn't bite into it and cause problems with depth. On the top side of this support, I made this little kind of boxed in area, and this is to hold the air pump off the ground. In some of my first installations, I didn't really allow for this, and that's one reason why the boards are longer than the totes, which are 30 inches each, or 60 inches total. With 66 inches, I have some extra room to put a support for the pump. So it goes in like that. These pumps do vibrate, and they may move because of their vibrations. So this is kind of a little cage to keep the pump in place. And then on the front end here, or what I might call the front of the pump, there are 2 outlets from this pump. And so this little open area here is intended to allow the air lines to pass through without being pinched. This is how I'm going to put the air stone into the new system. Now, in deep water culture, the air stone, of course, does need to be submerged in the water, but it does not need to be at the bottom of the tank, and this will actually just restrict the airflow. In a Kratky setup, some part of the roots is always under the surface and some parts of the roots are above the surface to breathe. As long as it's healthy, that won't be a problem. Now what I found with my tomato buckets over the course of the winter that were basically deep water buckets with air injected near the surface was that when I took them apart, the root balls were completely healthy, even though the air stone was near the top of the bucket, maybe a few inches below the surface. So I'm assuming similar results with this. This setup consists of a 3.5 inch angle brace, corner brace, whatever you want to call them, and a 4-inch air stone, and then of course a piece of tubing and 2 4-inch zip ties. And this assembly will be bolted onto the top of the tank. Now I'm just going to zoom in here and show you an important detail in terms of how tight to put the zip ties. The main point here is that you do not want to make this too tight. You can see here just a slight indentation in the tube which will restrict flow slightly, but it's just enough to keep the hose and the stone where I want them to be. And here is the port in the top, which I have designated as the service port. Right here you can see a 1/4 inch hole, and basically this assembly is just going to drop down like this and have a bolt, this bolt here, put through it to hold it into place, and I think that will give me a pretty good setup. As far as the top is concerned, I made 17 holes in the top following the grid pattern that was already on there. Based on my actual experience with lettuce plants getting to be fairly big, what I'm going to do is in this one I will only put like 9 lettuce sites, which would be these here. And those are about 7 or 8 inches apart. So the other sites either won't be used or will be used for small plants or plants of different types. For instance, I'm going to put some watercress in here, which will drape over the edge. Arugula may do the same thing. Chives will stand straight up. I may put a garlic plant in here, which would stand straight up. Cilantro and parsley, all of those sorts of things could actually be put in these end blocks here, and you could put cilantro or chives, garlic in some of those center places and really make efficient use of the space. One of the things that I found with the circulating system that I'm replacing is that 5 lettuce plants was actually more than a couple could use. They were basically picking leaves off and having all of the salad that they wanted. And then there were also other people in this facility who would just come up to the plants and pick off a leaf and eat it straight away because it was so tasty. And this is what you can look forward to with a system like this. Another detail I want to mention is I drilled these holes in the uprights in order to have a stopping point for the uprights on the frame, and just to hold them in place once they're in, I'm just using some of these 1 5/8" bullets that I use on a lot of my construction projects. So at the ends of this whole assembly, I made 2 1-inch holes in the cover to provide a socket for the PVC frame. As long as I'm here, I'm going to do an update on the other tomato plants that are here. This, of course, is the monster tomato plant of the Sun Gold tomatoes. This now has dozens of blossoms on it. There are small tomatoes forming at the bottom. It's basically reaching the 6-foot frame. So this is doing quite well. This is one of the more prolific plants that I've seen as far as tomatoes. And down beside it we have some of the other plants. The one in the center, the one that's in the center now, actually, there was a long spike that came up and looked really spindly, and there was a sucker coming out of the bottom, so I just allowed the sucker to grow and cut the spike back. So it's coming along. And there's another one down there. It's a little bit hard to see here, but what I'm using in order to string up these plants as they grow is something called the Prusik knot, which actually comes from mountain climbing. And basically you take the free end of the line, You make a loop and you put the line through the loop twice. And here we see the other tomatoes that are growing down here. They're coming along pretty well, setting flowers and fruits. Now at this point in time, I am cutting off some side branches and suckers in particular in order to encourage them to produce tomatoes. Here you see the Moscovich putting up a nice little bunch of tomatoes. Some more down below here. So that's coming along. There was one on the Black Prince plant and that has been taken off and eaten. Here's another one of the plants. So he's at about almost 4.5 feet tall. And here's the last one, kind of squat and bushy, but making flowers and growing at a good pace.